Okay, well, Tomek is not here because he thinks it's a 9 o'clock start,
Oh. Okay.
which would be 10 in Poland, I reckon. So maybe we need to contact him and tell him that it's going live and go through the instructions with him.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I thought that
It's
Ireland
also been
was,
advertised.
yeah, I thought Ireland was, yeah. I thought Ireland was the same time as the continent of Europe.
Yeah, so people who are watching out for the YouTube live stream will be thinking it's starting in 55 minutes.
Okay.
So people are going to miss us live, at least.
All right, well, the only alternative then is to wait an hour. Would that affect anybody else here? Okay. Well, Mike,
It doesn't affect anything.
No, we had two hands.
I'm good.
Who cannot do this in an hour? Okay, well, we lose 2 and gain 1. So, Michael, what do you want to do?
Who did we lose?
Okay. Did you want to lose 2 or what?
Who did we lose?
We lose Paul and we lose Roger. No, we don't lose Paul. We lose Roger, though. No, we don't lose Roger? Oh, okay, so you're all good. All right, so we'll wait an hour then. All right. Since we are an hour, do you have anybody you could hit up real quick to get some earphones? Or we lose Eileen? Okay. No. Okay, you want to talk. All right.
I'm a little confused because it was announced on Facebook that we were starting.
Earphones.
Okay. It was announced on Facebook that we were starting at noon Eastern Standard Time in the U.S. and I mean Pacific Standard Time and 3 U.S. time. So who is it that doesn't have the right time? It's not people in the U.S., but it's people in Europe. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right.
That was probably my fault because I thought Ireland was the same as the continent.
Well, I can go at 1. It's not a problem.
What time is it where you are, Eileen?
It's noon here right now, but I can easily come back on at 1. I just have to revise what I just put on Facebook. That's all.
Oh, sorry. I thought noon was the same as 2 p.m. for everybody else in the States.
No.
Is that?
No. So that's the problem with time zones. Okay. All right. Well, we'll just go in an hour. I'm gonna have to create another link on this, so I'll have to send you all another link. All right. So why don't we just sign off and come back in about 45 minutes?
That's okay.
Of course, we'll have to. Of course, the problem now. See, we started the broadcast and I stopped it. I guess maybe we'll just have to go with that, and we'll just go, with this kind of are we online or something like that. So we'll come back to this link. Otherwise, it gets too confusing. All right. So I'll. Yeah.
Carl?
Yeah.
I think I just see Roger is posting that Tomek is able to join us now. Is that right?
Okay. Well, then, yeah. So he should have the link because I sent it to him.
Are we missing anyone else?
There he is. I don't think so. Oh, hi. There he is, Tomek. But I don't see his picture. There he is.
There he is.
Okay. All right. All right, so let's can we work with this kind of protocol here to make sure we know what we're doing on raising our hand and stuff? Just could we have a kind of pre-conversation? You know, we could just introduce ourselves. Maybe that'd be a good thing to do. You know, so let's start with Eileen. Eileen, you want to introduce yourself? You'll do this again when we get on camera, but.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're.
I'm right. I'm unmuted now. I get it.
Yeah.
I use this every day, but anyway. So I'm Eileen Joy, and I'm the director of Punctum Books, but I'm also a former professor of medieval literature and cultural studies. As a scholar, my primary research is in the juxtaposition of pre-modern artifacts and contemporary artifacts and events in order to create a kind of shock of encounter between older and newer materials, especially relative to questions, and these are my chief interests as a scholar, of violence and embodiment, queer sexualities, Levinasian ethics, post-humanism, and what might be called the politics of friendship. So those are kind of my primary research areas, in addition to also being the editor of Post-Medieval, a journal of medieval cultural studies, and now also running Punctum Books. So how's that? That's okay for an intro, don't you think?
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So.
Oh, and now I'll mute myself.
Right. Michael?
Carl, Paul says we're broadcasting live on YouTube.
Paul, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks so much for including me, Michael. So my name is Paul Boshears, and I am based in Atlanta, Georgia, on the east coast of the United States. I am a PhD candidate at the European Graduate School, as well as one of the co-editors of a publication called Continent. And I also, while I am trying to finish up my graduate studies, I also work for a publication called Art Papers. I put things in the mail and make sure that they arrive where they're supposed to. My academic interests primarily, they tend to come from my long-standing interests in Chinese philosophies, particularly Confucianism. So from that interest, I began to develop, from that began my writings about pedagogy, and I think that's how I've sort of found myself looped into the para-academic, academic or pericariat sorts of conversations that Michael and Eileen particularly have been very generous to include me in. Thanks.
Okay. And Roger?
Hi, I'm Roger Whitson. I'm an assistant professor of English at Washington State University, which is right on the border of Washington State and Idaho. Some people always think I'm living in Seattle, but I'm not. And my work really looks at the adaptation of 19th century literature in digital media. And so I have a book out from Routledge called William Blake and the Digital Humanities, which looks at a lot of these issues. But I'm also very interested in issues of adjunct labor and precarity. I have an article that I'm working on queer steampunk. So I have some interest in that, but particularly as it's adapted or disseminated through digital media. So thank you.
All right. And Tomek.
Hi. I'm a professor of English at the Pedagogical University of Krakow, that's southern Poland. I've done work on American literature, Canadian literature, film, but particularly queer theory, I guess. Yeah, that's all about what I wanted to say.
Okay, Victor.
I'm Victor Taylor, and with Carl Raschke, the co-founder of GAIN. I'm also the chair of the English and Humanities Department at York College of Pennsylvania, and the executive editor of the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory. My interests are in theoretical humanities, sort of broadly construed, literature, religious studies, and philosophy. But recently, I've developed an interest in civic arts and humanities, and so I'm developing some projects here at the college, working on a grant proposal, and doing some urban humanities programming.
Okay, thank you, Vic. And I'm Carl Raschke. I'm professor of religious studies and teach philosophy at the University of Denver. I've got, like I think everybody else in this group, a broad set of interests. Lately, I'm working in the area of political theory, political theology, and critical theory, and developing new kind of nomenclatures and new forms of interdisciplinarity that bring together some of these old ways of thinking and doing things, but within a whole new idiom that might be loosely described as post-postmodern. If I can get a plug for my new book in this area, which is coming out this summer with Columbia University Press. It's called Force of God, Political Theology and the Crisis of Liberal Democracy. All right, and I'm sort of the moderator, and I apologize to this audience for the confusion here at the front, but this is, how it kind of works on YouTube. This is very spontaneous, so you get to see us in all our rawness here. Working with the technology. We're looking forward to a very fascinating conversation here. Michael O'Rourke, who I'm going to turn over to next, and I'm going to let him self-introduce like everybody. I never feel very comfortable about introducing people anyway, because I'm always going to say the wrong thing or not emphasize the right thing. But he's going to be talking about Belle Knox and the Indebted Woman. And of course, it's not just about her, it's about a whole range of issues having to do with sex work, feminism, critiques of feminism, what does feminism mean, etc., etc. And I'm really looking forward to this. So Michael's going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, kind of lay it out, and then everybody else can lay into them if they want to. All right, so Michael, it's all yours now.
Hi. I'd like to thank Carl and Victor first for inviting me to both be a fellow of GAIN, the Global Art and Ideas Nexus, and also for inviting me to do this critical conversation. Before I get started, I just want to say why I chose each of the discussants or conversants for this evening. I chose Eileen Joy because she is the ultimate renegade academic, and in leaving a secured tenured position to dedicate her life to producing and publishing who are at the margins of academia. She has always been committed, both when she was a tenured academic and now when she's an independent publisher, to creating modes of assemblage and solidarity for all those people who feel excluded by academic norms and academic propriety. So I really wanted Eileen in on this conversation, and also because of her major contributions to feminism and queer theory and questions to do with vulnerability and violence. I chose Paul Boshears because Paul set up the journal Continent, which to my mind is one of the most important flagship publications for what is called para-academic publishing. And Paul indeed has written extensively and persuasively about para-academia and the challenges one faces on the fringes of legitimate academic work. I chose who I've known for a very long time, both because he has written on pornography and sex work, but also because he has been positioned precariously for a long time in Polish academia, not only on the peripheries of academia and the institution, but also on the peripheries of geographical centrality, insofar as he is in a location in Eastern Europe which doesn't get read even by queer studies in the Anglophone world. So Tomac is a very important voice who's been doing work which has been ignored for a very long time. So I wanted him to be part of this conversation because it's very central, I think, to the project of queer studies going forward into the future. And lastly, I'm very pleased that Roger Whitson accepted my invitation at the last minute, because Roger has written about alt education, which is another name for what Paul calls para-academia and Eileen calls para-academia, and what I call peri-academia. So I'm very pleased to be here with you all for this conversation, and I'm going to say a little bit about the topic for discussion, which is Belle Knox, precarity, and the future of the humanities, and then I'm going to let you all lay into me. Okay, so my talk for this evening, it draws on a talk which I gave a short time ago, about 2 weeks ago, in Macedonia, which was called Belle Knox and the Making of the Indebted Woman, which all of the other discussants have read tonight. And that particular talk examined Belle Knox's writings about stratifications of sex work in the light of what Maurizio Lazzarato diagnoses as a generalized indebtedness and the moral compass which adjudicates as to who counts as a good indebted subject, worker or citizen in this epoch of immaterial labour and human capital. And in that paper I then went on to place Belle Knox's diagrammatization of the whorearchy, as she calls it, but within and outside the porn industry, alongside Gayle Rubin's schematizations of good and bad sex, and who falls inside or outside the line of the good or bad sexed subject or sexed citizen. And in this talk, however, and I'm inspired again by Belle Knox, I want to develop very briefly and no less tentatively than in the longer version, a third diagramming of the worker in the regime of what I want to call the academic whorearchy. Now, if my earlier talk was primarily concerned about the futures of feminism and queer theory, this one, and I hope our conversation, will busy itself with nothing less urgent than the future of the humanities itself. Now, Belle Knox, for those who are still unaware of who she is Miriam Weeks, a sophomore student now in women's studies at the prestigious Duke University in North Carolina. After her father's salary was halved when he was sent to work in Afghanistan as a military doctor, Knox was unable to pay her first-year freshman tuition fees, which are $60,000, and she decided to work in porn rather than become burdened with even more student loan. So she didn't want to further indebt herself. Subsequently, having filmed a couple of scenes, a fellow student outed her, having watched one of those scenes online, and this exposed Knox to great physical harm. However, she chose to take this unwilled exposure of her vulnerability as someone who had been a self-harmer and indeed raped at a high school party as an opportunity to speak publicly about student debt, the realities of sex work, self-harm, slut-shaming, rape culture, the rights of sex workers, legalization of prostitution, and a host of other issues. And she's written about these in a number of prominent publications in the United States, both online and in print. At 19 years old, she is already an eloquent and persuasive writer and an important theoretical and activist voice for young women around issues to do with sexuality, vulnerability, power, and resistance. In the last week alone, she's given an interview to the Business Insider announcing her aspirations to enter politics as a libertarian, with women's rights or human rights as her major issue. And she has tweeted that she will be the keynote speaker at Lafayette University's Women's Week next week, where she will talk about the realities of the life of a porn star behind and beyond the flickering screen. So that's Belle Knox. So that's the first part of my talk. The second is precarity. What do I mean by precarity? Now, one thing which Knox's attention to student debt has allowed me to think about is a refinement of the concept of the economic rabble and the precariat. Knox shows us how in the world of porn, or in the world of sex work, there is a stratification which works along particular lines, and sex, gender, race, and class, and of course ability, all play their parts in stratification. But what this illuminates is how the world of work itself more general, with good workers at the centre and bad workers at its outer rim. So in response to this, I suggest that we name the workers or indebted subjects at the outer fringes as the precarity. There is, I am suggesting, a precariousness which is more precarious than precarity itself. And it is only those who are at the marginalised circumference who are really in a position to see this, and we need to listen to them rather than speaking for them. This would lead to an entire remapping of the situation of the worker under global capitalism and a structure of being towards debt, D-E-B-T. It's a play on words which Lazzarato uses, referencing the Heideggerian being towards debt. And this structure of being toward debt has turned everyone into entrepreneurs of the self. But those at the very bottom of the economic rabble, the abjected, what Eileen would call the illegitimate, the educated unemployed, the precariat, they are, I would suggest, best placed as the agents of emancipatory struggle against the bio-necro political injunction that she become human capital with the promise to pay back her debt and to remain a docile subject. Knox manages her own time and evaluates her own behaviour publicly, thereby disrupting the calculative temporalities and spatialities of the governed or surveilled subject under capitalism. We could say that Knox is a figure for what I'll name the sous-veillant subject. Sous meaning under in French, so I'm calling her a figure for the sous-veillant subject, which would be the victim of global capitalism who comes under in order to manage the ways in which he can live and survive. Knox is, I would suggest, exemplary of what we could call the new economic undercommons. And this economic undercommons, I will suggest, is poised to make a human strike, as the activist collective Clairefontaine call it, against the orders of capitalism and of debt. These self-authorizing temporalities and just one another, or what Judith Butler and Athania Athanasiou in Dispossession call supra-individual modes that are out of sync with regimes of social regulation and the identitarian apparatus. Kathy Weeks, who teaches in the Duke Women's Studies program where Miriam Weeks, Belle, is a student, calls this post-work imaginary getting a life, by which she means getting a full life, or a life in the Deleuzian sense. Okay, so I want to go through some of the new concepts which I've developed in my work on Belle Knox, and the first is the fourth wave. So when I talk of the emergence of a fourth wave of feminism in Knox's work in her writing, I'm already aware that there is an established body of writing already out there claiming we're riding this fourth wave. However, my argument about the already existing feminism going by this name is that it is precisely against all that Knox stands for. It is slut-shaming, whereas she is slut-affirming. It speaks from positions of institutionalized power and privilege, whereas she speaks from the position of an undergraduate and a sex worker. It is anti-sex, she's pro-sex. It's anti-pleasure, she's pro-pleasure. And it polices in the Rancierian sense who is in and who is out of feminism, whereas Knox wants to open feminism up to anyone, to all comers. Knox's tearing down of the whorearchy, as she calls it, within sex work also dismantles the whorearchy which is operative in contemporary feminism, and in so doing she argues for modes of collectivity and solidarity which current feminisms, in what I would suggest is a regression to 1970s radical feminism, with their frontier of border controls, stigmatizations and delegitimizations, would refuse. And these are times of great danger, as Gayle Rubin already predicted in 1982 for feminism. Knox's articles on sex workers and on the intractable virgin-whore dichotomies which subtend patriarchal systems should alert us to the fact that the dangers Rubin presaged have not gone away, and that Knox suggested and shared vulnerability which should bring us together if we are to manage the dangers and transformations of our era. And this bears no less, I think, on academic work, where forms of solidarity between those inside the charm circle or the institution and those at its edges are all too rare, and this lack of solidarity between tenured academics and precarious ones paralyzes the potential for networks of sustenance between those who are most secure and those who are most vulnerable in our academic pericariat. It seems to me that there are networks of support between those who are on the fringes, much more than there are networks of support between those who are inside academia and those who lie out with it. Gain would be a notable exception to this trend. Okay, my next formulation, which I'm going to take you very briefly through, is what I call perivo-feminism, which is parvo-feminism, but I've inserted the I of the peri, so perivo-feminism. 40 years before Knox wrote about the whorearchy, Gayle Rubin was already arguing for a radical shift in and development of terminologies, tools and optics which would allow feminism to interrogate the hierarchies of normative and non-normative or non-heteronormative practices, positions, tendencies and orientations. And this in turn gave us the theoretical tools to think through scales of power, oppression, persecution, denunciation and marginalization. As we know, this eventually was given the name queer theory, and Rubin's work was extremely influential, although this is not always acknowledged, on the development of what would come to be called sexuality studies and ultimately queer theory. But what should we call Knox's own interventions into a feminism which she sees, just as Rubin did, as being bereft of the right tools for thinking the strategies of permissibilization and marginalization? Now, I've suggested that we call this parvo theory or perivo theory. And I say perivo because this nomenclature has the bonus of highlighting how, even in theoretical attentions to perversion, there is an exclusion and a shunting out to the furthest reaches. So even within perversion, there are those who are even more perverse, even more peripheral, or even more revolting. And I'm referring there to a conference which Rafał and Tomek were instrumental in organizing in Poland last year, called Revolting Peripheries. So perivo feminism is marginal both academically and institutionally. Of course, it would be marginal to the institutional versions of feminism, but it's also marginal in relation to contemporary fourth wave feminism, because it advocates pleasure, danger and joy over against the moralizing, privilege checking, anti-mansplaining, anti-porn, anti-sex, anti-pleasure, anti-jouissance, slut-shaming, sex trolling of current feminisms. which I've given the name Mean Girl Feminism, trademark. And I'll take you through what I mean by Mean Girl Feminism now. So Parizeau theory is counter to what I want to call Mean Girl Feminism, which adjudicates and moralizes about who is in and who is out. Mean girls determine who can be feminist and who cannot, who can be queer and who cannot, what counts as good sex and counts as bad sex, who counts as a good girl and who does not, who counts as a good boy and who does not, who is at the centre and who is at the periphery, what practices are at the centre and what practices or acts are at the circumference or the outer edges. It's quite startling that 40 years after Rubin drew those diagrams of good and bad sex that were S&M and anti-porn as she was in the early 80s. Another coinage of mine, although it's not really a coinage, is to say that Parizeau theory would be a species of what I want to call a fucking book I'd like to write at some point. Now, fucking feminism is a feminism which is unapologetically sex positive, as in positive about all sex. And it also fucks with feminism, or it fucks with the mean girl or killjoy feminisms of all stripes, which are dominating the feminist landscape at this particular conjuncture. And to bring this all together, here is my manifesto for Parizeau feminist theory, which Roger has already cited yesterday on Facebook. With the emergence of the third wave of ever faster, more accelerated feminisms on blogs, Twitter, Instagram, Vine, Snapchat, and other social media, including Facebook, we have witnessed, as Knox has written in several places, greater and greater shaming by feminists of other feminists who in their eyes are revolting in every sense. In being revolting, in fucking with feminism, Knox ushers in a fourth wave. And by waves we need not necessarily read them as simply overlapping or succeeding. We might instead suggest that Knox is tuning into radio frequencies, tuning into Rubin's work from the second wave and extrapolating new paradigms, tuning in and turning up Cedric's axioms and lists of tendencies from our epistemology of the closet and expanding them for the 20-teens. In several respects, this stroboscopic, hyper-accelerated feminism, which highlights new issues and concerns, is one for what I call the precariat, those who are at the margins theoretically, institutionally, as workers, as subjects, as intellectuals. The precariat are at the margins even of the precariat. Knox is a fast feminist in Shannon Bell's sense. She fucks feminist orthodoxies, she squirts, she writes with her cum. She doesn't just write feminism, she does it. And like Rubin, she is a self-poetic ethnographer of sex. In the face of the manifold regressions of feminism to arguments about who to include and who to violently exclude, Knox advocates modes of collective crafting and solidarity, compassion and shared endeavour, work that can only be done from precarious postures at the margins of institutional and all other systems of power. In what Beatriz Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic era, Knox eschews the phallic power of the killjoy girls and exuberantly celebrates copyleft feminisms, ones which won't get canonized, won't get retweeted, won't get celebritized, and won't get endlessly cited. But Knox doesn't give a fuck, and Parizeau feminists shouldn't give a fuck. The task is not about deciding who is in and who is out, but rather, with Knox, of creating pornotopic spaces for promiscuous thought, for more and more ways of doing things together, more and more ways of fucking things up together. And my last formulation, before I go into my diagrams, is slut feminisms. I've also called this self-poiesis, which is also a folding or going towards others, slut feminism, a self-nomination in response to the slut-shaming by mean girl feminisms. And it's also, in a similar way, it's a reclamation of a term in the same way that queer has been reclaimed as a term not of insult, but one of affirmation. If Knox chose her performer name Belle Knox, remembered by anyone, I choose slut feminism because it is unlikely to become a brand or a cult like Mean Girl or Killjoy feminisms. Knox herself refers to it as gotcha feminism. and she reveals how gotcha or mean girl feminisms only serve to further exploit and render vulnerable those populations, the economic or sexual rabble, who are already vulnerable. As Laurie Penny argues in her book Unspeakable Things, slut power means speaking up or speaking back, reclaiming and alchemizing a term of insult and censure, and turning the word slut, like crip or queer, into a term of valorization and shamelessness or shamefulness. Slut is, Penny says, a word and an idea that desperately needs to be taken back. And Laurie Penny, like Knox, grabs the pejorative slut and whore with both hands for feminism and extends the category of the sexual rabble to include, and this is a quote from Penny, poor women fucking, black women fucking, queer women fucking, old women fucking, fat women fucking, ugly women fucking, bossy, arrogant women fucking, women who are dominant in bed, women who like to penetrate men with big pink strap-ons, women who want multiple sex partners at once or in succession, women who just want to go to bed early with a cup of tea, an Anna Span DVD and a spiked dildo the size of an eggplant, sex workers who want to be treated like workers rather than social pariahs, men who want to get fucked, men who are gentle and submissive in bed, men for whom sex is an overwhelming emotional experience. I guarantee you that all of these things go on, but any of them might actually destabilize for a second our cultural narratives of sex, gender and power, so none of them are allowed to be trends. Rubin began the essay Thinking Sex all those years ago with the memorable line, "The time has come to think about sex." The time has come now, I would argue, to think about slut feminism. And I'm going further now to think about the academic hierarchy. So I'll now provide a brief guide to my diagramming of the inner and outer limits of academia. And those who are in the conversation have seen these diagrams already, but I'll make them available afterwards for everybody. Okay, so the first diagram is based on Gayle Rubin's very famous diagrams, originally drawn in 1982 for the Barnard Conference, which was at the forefront of the sex wars in the 80s. The first diagram, which she called the charm circle versus the outer limits, and then the second, the struggle over where to draw the line. So the first diagram, one which people will be very familiar with, at the center of the circle you have good, normal, natural, blessed, permitted, or charmed sex. So at the center you have the inner part of the circle, you have respectable behavior, and that respectable behavior is heterosexual, married, monogamous, procreative, private, at home, with a partner, in pairs, in a relationship, free or non-commercial, same generation, no pornography, bodies only, and vanilla. And at the outer limits of the circle, of the charm circle, you have damned, restricted, unnatural, and abnormal sex, and that would, in this 1984 diagram, that is homosexual, unmarried, promiscuous, non-reproductive, public, in the park, in groups or alone, masturbatory, casual, for money, abnormal, cross-generation, obscene, pornographic, with manufactured objects, fetishistic, technological, and sadomasochistic. Now the other diagram of the sex hierarchy is where she has drawn the walls. So there are 3 walls. So you have good sex, bad sex, and you have the lines of constant station in between. Now I've reproduced these, but I've also made some additions to it, and I'm sure people could make further additions. So on the left hand side, good sex, normal, natural, healthy, holy, is heterosexual, married, reproductive, procreative, but it's also, I would add, vaginal, able-bodied, young but not too young, slim, and also at home, domestic. Then slightly to the right of that we have the main or major areas of contact which draw the line or bifurcate good and bad sex. So you've got lesbian, homosexual, even if they're in monogamous long-term relationships. But you've also got the stable, you've got stable lesbian unmarried heterosexuals in public, which would be in bars, but you've also got promiscuous gay men, and for Rubin that's in baths or the park. So even at home, those unmarried heterosexual relationships or those stable lesbian and gay relationships would contest the line of good sex, or would cross the line in some way. Then just slightly to the right of that, in the line of space of contestation, you have people who use webcams or engage in webcam sex, the hand job, and then shifting slightly to the right of the hand job in terms of worse would be oral, and shifting further again would be anal. Then again, shifting further across, these are not mentioned by Rubin, but you've got masturbation, bisexual relationships, threesomes, or indeed multiple or orgy situations. And then bad sex, she's listed for money and cross-generational. But cross or intergenerational would now have sunk right to the bottom of the sexual rabble since she wrote in 1984, since she drew this diagram in 1984, since paedophilia would now be considered to be the very outermost limit, even though there would be stratifications even within cross and intergenerational sex, depending on circumstance or depending on what country you're in, indeed. Again, she doesn't mention rimming, disabled sex or crip sex, or old sex or fat sex. They would also come under the category of the worst. Somewhere slightly to the left of the worst would be interracial relationships, also voyeurism. And voyeurism can take on different forms. It can be voyeurism which is willed, as in dogging, for example, or it can be voyeurism which is unwilled. And then toys, I think it's hard to say where in this on the diagram to place toys, because in a sense they're used mostly in the home, but they're also probably considered to fall under the category of bad sex. And then under the worst, Rubin has transvestite, which arguably might need to shift toward the left in terms of public acceptability of transvestism now. But then you have transsexuals, and now one would have to add transgender, female to male and male to female, to transsexual, male to female and female to male. And then there's surgery or no surgery, hormones or no hormones, and so on. So there are stratifications even within the trans category. Fetishists, sadomasochists, people into rough or kink, as Belle Knox is, then outdoor. She doesn't mention public sex, oddly, in that diagram. And fisting and rimming would, even more than anal, be at the outer edges of her thinking sex diagram. So that's just an attempt to update a little bit Rubin's diagram of sex. Now, my third diagram is based on Belle Knox, an article she wrote called Tearing Down the Hierarchy from the Inside last year. And good sex worker at the top, you would have phone sex or webcam girls or webcam boys who have no contact either with their clients, or no physical contact either with their clients or the police. Then also in the good sex category are stripping, stripping, indoor, online, or escorts. this is because they have minimal intimacy with either their clients or the police. Bad sex work, that on the right-hand side, those who fall into the category of bad sex workers are those who work in porn, prostitution, outdoor or on the street, because they have frequent contact or intimate contact with either their clients or the police. But even within porn, Knox identifies a bad sex layer, and that encompasses for her interracial, rough, gay and trans, and that's particularly because of the stigmatizations around AIDS. And my final diagram, which is the academic hierarchy. Okay, so at the top of the academic hierarchy you would have public intellectuals, then chancellors or deans, then professors, then tenured lecturers, then postdoctoral researchers, then adjunct lecturers or teaching assistants, then PhD students, then postgraduates, MA, undergraduates, then administrative, and then at the very bottom you have unemployed academics, para-academics, peri-academics, or dropouts. Now those at the top, which is everyone who has a secure academic position or a secure research position, they have access to funding, they're salaried, they have access to travel funds, they get paid honoraria, they have a secure affiliation, they have access to libraries, they have access to online journals and web resources, they have access to photocopying, printing and other infrastructural resources which para-academics do not. They get paid for supervision, they get paid for class preparation, syllabus design, and they also get paid for office hours. As you move down the strata, adjuncts, TAs and PhD students, postgraduates and undergraduates, they have very limited access to funding. They may have some funding, but mostly they're self-funded, whether that's student debt or loans from their parents or loans from family members. And as you go down to the bottom, you have para or peri academics. They usually work elsewhere, or they're parenting, or they're unemployed, they're freelancing. They are what a friend of mine, Rebecca Bly, called text workers. A lot of people, and Tomac will be able to speak about this, do translating work in order to supplement their lowly income from academic work. They also have to use public transport a lot of the time, so access to that kind of infrastructure is important. Then in terms of forms of writing and forms of publishing, para or peri academics are more likely to blog, which is very important output in terms of publication and in terms of intellectual work, but it's totally unpaid. And that brings me to the final point, hierarchy of publishing. Those who are at the top of the academic hierarchy tend to publish in university presses or in refereed journals. They also get paid, or maybe not, this may be a line of contestation, for things like editing or peer reviewing or indeed writing recommendation letters for people. Whereas those at the bottom, the unemployed, whether temporarily or long-term, para-academics, peri-academics, and so on, are much more likely to publish open access or to develop open access publishing endeavors of their own. So my point is that one can move from the strata of good sex and bad sex to the strata of good worker and bad worker, and that also maps onto the ways in which academics can be considered good academics or bad academics in ways which are hierarchical or deeply stratified. So that's it.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Michael. This is time now for other people to jump in. And just remember, raise your hand first so I can see you, and then and then unmute yourself. So we'll start with Eileen.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Michael for, in some respects, returning us. I'm going to call this the conversation that has been going on ever since Gayle Rubin's influential work, and possibly even before that, but I don't want to trace that long of a history. But I just want to start out by saying that I have a personal investment in this whole discussion, especially from a slightly more historical perspective, because this idea of a fucking feminism, a pro-sex, positive sex feminism, and a so-called fourth wave feminism that represents women who are scholars and also pro-sex, which has always been looked at as a kind of scandal. And I guess what I want to say here is sex, not sexuality, but sex and sex practice always represents a kind of final frontier that most people cannot get over, no matter what. And I say this as someone who was living on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., when the Mapplethorpe exhibit was dismantled at the Corcoran and re-staged at a basement gallery on F Street after the National Endowment for the Arts threatened to shut down the museum as a result of staging this show. Keep in mind how long ago that is. That's the mid-1980s. So that's my number one point. Number two, in 1995, a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Chris Mazza, created a little anthology called Post-Feminist Fiction, Chick Lit, a term she coined way before Bridget Jones's Diary, to sum up fiction writing by women who wanted to embrace exactly what Michael is describing here through Belle Knox. I was actually in that anthology, which anthology was held up in Congress during further debates over whether or not to defund, again, the NEA. That was 1995. Okay. Then in the early 2000s, you have scholars like Mary Lisa Johnson, who published a collection of essays called Jane Sexes It Up, which came out in 2002, which included essays by feminist academics. So again, there's a kind of privileged status to this, but essentially all of them putting forward essays relative to what Michael is talking about here, anti-slut-shaming essays in which various feminist radical academics put forward the idea that, yes, we can enjoy rough sex, we can enjoy rape fantasies, etc., and this makes us no less good feminist for that very same reason. So my first opening comment is just to say that one of the things we might want to think about is not why Belle Knox's challenge is new, but why it is always the challenge that gets raised again and again within feminist and queer discussions of sexuality, which, although they are dependent on sex practice for their metaphors and their theoretical stratagems, right, that are supposedly liberatory, often don't really want to talk about the more uncomfortable topic of actual sex work, right, in ways that don't escape the automatic moralizing move to shut down the discussion. And of course, with trans studies now, in a sense, on a kind of rise, I think this discussion is going to become even more critical. So that's just my way of saying or asking, you know, how it is that sex practice, especially within labor arenas like sex work, pornography, prostitution, etc., remains a kind of untouchable space that many academic theorists are uncomfortable inside of or confronting, even though, as I'm trying to trace from Mapplethorpe to Chris Mazza's chick-lit anthologies, to Mary Lisa Johnson's work, with so-called fourth wave positive sex feminism, why this is an area that in the public realm especially really bothers and disturbs people, including academics who don't quite know what to do about this, which means also the body itself is the thing that, although it is over-theorized at this point, in its real materiality, its messy desires, frightens and distresses people. And so that's all I have to say to start with.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Eileen. Anybody else want to jump in here? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, Roger.
Hey, I just want to thank Michael again for inviting me in on this conversation, because I think it's really important. And I've also, for a long time, Eileen, Mike, and Michael and Paul particularly have been very inspirational to my own work. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with them. So I have a few comments kind of all over the place, because this work has inspired a lot of thoughts in me, particularly because of my work in digital media, and what Michael labels sort of the killjoy mean girl feminism is something I've encountered quite a bit on social media. So I'm going to start out with sort of a theorist in my own field, the digital humanities, Jacob Gabri, who talks about this phenomenon called queer computing. And his argument is that social media creates this form of power based upon kind of computational legitimacy of gender categories. And the way that he describes this is in terms of drop-down menus and metadata. So the idea is that they're, like you're thinking about Facebook having all of the different options for gender, and oh, that's great. The problem that Gabri talks about is that oftentimes these options are separate and discrete. And so there are more options, but all of the options are separate. Like, you can't pick more than one. And the other thing that's interesting is that this impacts sex work, particularly through algorithms. And so I'm thinking in terms of how Twitter, for instance, will censor some photos and not others. And oftentimes the way that these things happen are along certain hierarchies that Michael lays out. So, for instance, Twitter's very popular among the porn industry, but oftentimes the photos that are censored are the ones that don't receive any sort of or very much backlash. So oftentimes they're genderqueer forms of porn that are censored images, whereas very heteronormative from large porn companies, they don't bother with that because they'll have a lot of backlash from angry hetero customers. And so I think there's a lot of ways in which sort of discussing this kind of hierarchy amongst different kinds of sexual practices can be fascinating, particularly when we're talking about the different kinds of interactions that occur on social media sites. And I'll reserve other stuff for later, but I just wanted to start with that. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, okay, Victor.
I'd like to maybe tie together a little bit what Eileen and Michael said in terms of the sort of development of a sort of new field of discourse. And I'm just sort of wondering, as Eileen was talking about the Mapplethorpe situation, one of my first publications was on Mapplethorpe in a legal studies journal. And I wonder if, in thinking about these various issues, especially in terms of the academy, if thinking about them in terms of market, for instance, there's certain, when you publish a book, you always have to, do what, how is it marketable? Who are you going to market it to? And I wonder in these situations, from what Eileen described, or some of the fourth wave feminism discourse, who would be the market for that discourse? In the sense that, who would be able to use that discourse in a way that would serve the interests of the conventional academy. That's what I'm trying to think about this in terms of, certain forms of feminism, certain forms of other discourses, postmodernism. We see how they fit a market because they have a very clear traditional, conventional use. And it seems like the thing that separates some discourses from others is their conventionality within sort of the market value system of the academy. What Michael described, the hierarchy of that, because it's not just a hierarchy of place. I mean, there's a mobility within that hierarchy. And if you can't make something marketable, then you don't have movement within that hierarchy. So that's just sort of an open thought I had. Maybe Michael and Eileen could speak to that or provide a context for it.
Michael or Eileen, do you want to respond to that, or not? Okay, Eileen.
Sorry about that. I want Michael. I would like Michael to also speak to this, but I just wanted to say briefly that Carl kind of summed up exactly what I think is wrong with publishing right now, especially as he so astutely observes how it not only relates to existing conversations within the university, but even directs and shapes those conversations, right? I mean, in some ways, the kind of utopian view of publishing is that it would somehow be an outlet for truly representing what people are talking about and why that supposedly matters. Unfortunately, most university and commercial academic presses have taken on certain protocols of review, and we've all read the questionnaires. If you've ever been asked to review a book, you've had to fill out the 27-page questionnaire with all sorts of marketing questions, which now, when I'm asked to review a book, I literally say, here are my thoughts on the book, and here are the reasons why I'm not answering your marketing questions, okay? So this is my long-winded way, and I actually did that recently with a book from Minnesota. I was like, fuck these questions about marketing. This is crazy, okay? I mean, the more important question is, why does this book matter? And what people don't realize is those protocols end up actually occluding work that cannot be defined in terms of either its marketing potential, meaning this is important to a conversation that's already happening, as opposed to no one ever thought of this before, and I have no idea how it connects to anything, but that doesn't make it less valuable as thought, right? So the reason I wanted to sketch that long history is to say we've been here before, and then we were there again, and then we went there again. Why does this particular conversation have to keep getting rebooted, which is a different question than why did it, well, it's related to how come what Michael is talking about, which he has also historically traced mainly through Sedgwick and Rubin, because what Michael is drawing our attention to is two of the most important figures in sex and sexuality studies urged us and cajoled us and beautifully intellectually framed between actual sex and what might be called liberation politics, right? Whether framed through queer activism or feminism or race-based consciousness raising, class-based movements, etc. So as far as how this relates to publishing, and then I'll shut up again about this, is that, you know, clearly for whatever reasons, and we might investigate them further here, this particular subject, sex positive, dirty, fucking, whatever you want to call it, has always been the thing that can't quite be encountered in such a way that it would give rise to a body of work that could be said to have a history, that can be said to have influenced publishing, which can then be said to have influenced actual organization of academic curricula, right? and conversations that can be said to have a history in the same way queer studies can be said to have a history, or feminism can be said to have waves. Well, fourth wave feminism, again, was being discussed back in 1995 when Chris Mazza's coining of the term post-feminist mainly just pissed off feminists. Initially, they just pissed everybody off. And I actually, this is a little known secret that I don't think even Michael knows. When I first founded with other people the Babel Working Group in 2004, our first name for the group was GPS, which we thought was funny, Global Positioning System, but it meant Group for Post-Feminist Scholarship. We organized 2 sessions at one conference, and a very famous feminist came up to us and said, I want to publish the stuff you're working on, which, by the way, she did end up doing, but you have to change your name because it's offensive. So we did, to Babel. That's a true story. So I'll shut up now, but that's just to outline, you know, the kinds of problems relative to what Carl was just talking about, and then let's see what Michael wants to say about that.
Okay, Michael, you want to come back here? By the way, I have some very interesting thoughts about the whole marketing.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Because I actually dropped out during Eileen's remarks. So if you can put up your hand if you can hear me, okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. I'll just respond to a couple of things Eileen said, which largely bear on the sort of historical legacy of this sort of sex-aversive feminism, which we're witnessing again in this sort of rebooting that Eileen is talking about, or this recursivity, which plagues and dogs both feminist thinking and queer thinking. And it comes back to something Leo Bersani said in one of his dynamite grenade lobbing opening sentences that he's so famous for. He said, like, there's a secret about sex, which is that not many people like it. And queer theory's secret about sex is that it doesn't really like talking about it. It likes, as Eileen says, to use it for its metaphors, and likes to flirt with the idea that it's sex positive and that it's all about sex. But it's not. It's all about sexuality and identity, which has absolutely nothing to do and cannot cleave to and cannot be articulated with sex practices in all of their variegation. And this discomforts queer theorists and feminist theorists because they want their anatomy, their gender, their sex, and their sexuality, and their sexual acts and practices and their identities to be nicely and neatly lined up together. They don't want any mess, or they don't want any proliferation or miscegenation. They don't want anything dirty or overspilling or abject. And this goes right back to, as Eileen said, a collection like Jane Sexes It Up, which was a fabulous bunch in the early 2000s of sex-positive essays by, again, they were mostly tenured academics. But it created a backlash. And it's startling that Belle Knox in 2014 is saying something that in the 80s was argued over, that in the 90s was argued over, that in the noughties was argued over. And here we are again arguing about what counts as good sex or what counts as bad sex. So in a sense, it's about institutional legacies. It's like, why are Cedric and Rubin, who, as Eileen pointed out, are already saying all these kinds of things in 1984 in Rubin's case, in 1990 and 91, and even though they're considered mothers in inverted commas of queer studies or sexuality studies, are lessons not been learned from them? Why is it that a 19-year-old girl can cause more awareness within queer studies, totemic figures. And it seems to me that the only answer to that is that there has been a massive occlusion of Sedgwick and Rubin's work from within queer studies itself. It can only be, and this comes down to Victor's question about marketization and institutionalization of ideas, that queer studies has had to distance itself and its particular objects of inquiry from two of the most important figures in order to promulgate a nice, clean, tidy queer studies. And Tomek actually might be able to say more about this. So that's my response to Eileen and Victor.
Tomek, would you like to jump into this and answer Michael's question? You have some things to say about this?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer Michael's question so much. Can you hear me? No. Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, just a few points. I have many, but I will choose some. You've been talking about sort of about the history, okay, sort of a historical perspective on wars over sexuality, pro-porn, anti-porn, feminism, and so on. Obviously, you know, as Michael said, I represent a peripheral voice here, and from a Polish perspective, obviously, a historical narrative we would need to propose would be quite different. Not that the American context is not important, not that it's not studied, not that Gayle Rubin's work or Sedgwick's work is not utterly important in our context. But when you talk about what I see, there's a sort of trace of linear thinking about history, I think, in what Eileen and Michael were saying, in the sense that Michael is sort of surprised that that Belle Knox comes back to issues which were discussed 20, 30 years ago, which would suggest that things should rather develop in a more linear manner. And this is a little bit of a criticism, perhaps, also of thinking even in terms of waves, like waves of feminism. So that's my one point, sort of, about this sort of historical linear narrative. Now, okay, in the first place, of course, what is so admirable about all Michael's work is how he's always trying to squeeze out the most positive potential out of any, situation, scandal, sort of public event. How he's trying to frame a narrative that actually opens up some sort of positive outlook on what can be done now, what should be done now, where we can go from here. I do have, however, a few reservations. I don't want to take too much time. So maybe I will. I can talk about my reservations about Belle Knox a bit later. Just two things I also thought I would say is on a maybe lighter note, is when Michael ended his talk saying about what constitutes good work and bad work in the academy versus what's good sex and bad sex. So the question that came to my mind immediately is, do good academics have good sex? Which is something interesting to be researched, I guess. Another thing, when I read Michael's piece, talking about my peripheral position, and this is also something Michael sort of pointed out when he introduced me. When I read that Belle Knox as a waitress was making nearly $400 a week, that's pretty much my if you multiply it by 4, that's pretty much my monthly salary, which by Polish standards it's actually above the national average, so it's not so bad, really. Okay, if I get another chance, I can talk about my reservations about Belle Knox. Okay, thank you.
Tobik, do you mind just quickly summarizing what the reservations are? That I think that might take it slightly in a different direction. We've got about 20 minutes here at the most, and we kind of need to try to bring some of these threads together. But you know, I think it'd be good to hear some critique.
Yeah. I think one has to be also okay. Number one, Belle Knox's story is a very American story. Okay, it is a very, very American story. It has already been fictionalized, as I read in Michael's piece. I guess, you know, a TV series could be made called, I don't know, American Horror Story, on this basis, and another aspect that cannot be ignored is also, you know, this libertarian sort of politics behind it. So when Michael so wonderfully, in many ways, sort of announces or calls for kind of performatively as a performative act, speech act, you know, what he calls for when he calls for this fourth wave of feminism. I'm not so sure that I would like the fourth wave of feminism to be precisely libertarian. And I know that libertarianism cannot be easily equated with neoliberalism, but in certain ways, you know, the two overlap, especially in the American context, actually, perhaps more than in other contexts. And I realized that, okay, not to say I'm against Belle Knox, or I'm staunchly for sex-positive feminism, and a lot of the points that Belle Knox makes, she makes very sharply, very much to the point, and you know, it's uplifting and thought-provoking. But at the same time, I can also, I think, see ways in which okay, in which I wouldn't precisely agree with a certain sort of politics, not concerning precisely, perhaps, you know, this sex-positive question, where I agree, but perhaps the way, some of the ways in which she frames her story are a bit problematic to me. For instance, when she says, makes such statements as, I like what I like, and that's it, okay? And what I like in bed is sort of, okay, don't give me a bad name as a feminist because I like what I like. Sure, I mean, absolutely. Everybody has the right to say I like what I like, and you know, I may have rape fantasies and so on. At the same time, the interesting thing would be precisely to try and sort of theorize somehow, or I don't know, reflect on the connection between what we like in bed, or how we like to play with power relations in, I don't know, BDSM subcultures, and how that ultimately relates to the social and socio-political field and the hierarchies, actually, and how desire is not, of course, an extra social. It's not outside of the social field. It's equally shaped, and its flows, desire's flows, are equally shaped by socio-political factors. So this is a link, for instance, I'm missing from Belle Knox's narrative.
Michael, do you want to? Yeah, you want to respond to that? Go ahead. Let's Michael say something. We'll let Paul talk.
Yeah, sure. I actually share stations. I certainly wouldn't want to valorize her as an unproblematic voice for the kind of feminism, sex-positive feminism, I'm arguing for. Because, as Tomek rightly points out, $400 is far from an academic in a month in Poland, as he does, or for someone like me who's currently on social welfare, I wouldn't earn anything like that either. So, just half, in fact. So, some of her narrative, of course, is problematic because it already comes from a certain place of privilege. or a space of privilege. And there are certainly linkages in her narrative which, to me, need some theoretical filling in. And Tomek points out one, which is the I like what I like. But another would be her motivations for doing work in porn and having been raped as a teenager. It seems to me that that is something that the Special Victims Unit episode picked up on quite a bit. So it would be interesting to hear her articulate more. She's written about rape culture quite a lot, but articulate more about what it was that there is that made her move from a position of someone who had been violated to do a scene which she has tried to distance herself from, which is precisely about, in a sense, a reiteration of that violation, and then to more positive and more managed and more governed in terms of the ways in which she has control of the situations, types of scene, to see her at least theorize a little bit more in her writing. But one must remember she's a second-year undergraduate. We're expecting rather a lot of her. And the other thing I wanted to follow on from with Tomek is very brief. Is that how does what Belle Knox is saying about sex work lead on to more detailed or engaged discussions about social practices? And I think that's what I'm trying to do with connecting her with arguments around, I guess, the Italian workerist stuff around immaterial labour, and then the sort of French context around feminism with multitude. And also, I suppose, Euro-American almost feminisms, like not feminism, but philosophies around communism and the workers, such as Zizek and Badiou. So I think I'm trying to make a larger argument about the worker, or the governed worker, or the citizen, which extrapolates from what Belle Knox is saying about labour, and how queer studies is, with Beatriz Preciado's recent thing, how that's influenced by Negri and Hart, and how she comes out precisely out of that early 90s set of arguments around autonomism and so on, which gave birth to the Clairefontaine Collective, which I mentioned, the Invisible Committee, and Tikkun. So there's a whole European context which isn't probably as familiar to US queer studies audiences, which Belle Knox is arguably in my reading of her Tappy students. Okay.
Okay, Victor and Paul, did you still want to say something? Because you had your hand in earlier. Okay, we'll take Paul. We'll go to Victor, and then we'll go back to Michael for final. Then we're going to have to wrap up here. So, Paul, go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, thanks so much, Michael. I think Tomek put it really well. That you're really exceptional at bringing forward the best parts that we should consider in something. And I don't have anything particularly sophisticated to say here. In part, I don't have sophisticated knowledge of these bodies of work, and they're certainly parochial. But one thing that seems to be kind of coming throughout, and I'd love to learn more about, is the question seems to be, what do we owe one another, right? What obligations do we have to one another? I share Tomek's reservations about libertarianism, because it relies on this rights talk. And what rights do we have to each other in a sex act, right? Actually, Roger had brought up discovery earlier, and we've recently published something in the newest issue of Art Papers. Not that I'm trying to plug Art Papers, but with something about vernacular computing, where he talks about people who don't, like our grandmothers, who sign off on Facebook with "love you, comma, grandma." You know, people deliberately don't do it right, and we should study that, which is, I think, Michael's point as well. So yeah, really, I just wanted to, and again, coming from this Confucian perspective, where you're born already overly obligated, and you will always be obligated, and the only way you can make yourself, for example, I would be born as a son to my my parents, but I have a brother, so the way I become this particular son is by managing those debts that ought never be paid off. I ought to find better and better ways of keeping myself more and more obligated to my parents, then to my neighbors and to my teachers, and on and on. And the worst thing that could possibly happen to me would be to be in the position of not having any claims against me. You know, I'm a richer person for having those debts placed upon me. I'm also I go to a strange school where I have six-figure debt. You know, I've always worked my entire education. I will continue to work for however long. I just love the practice of doing academic-y type of work. There's a way of leveraging these obligations that I have to other folks. I'm not sure exactly how to. I don't have, again, a robust or sophisticated language, perhaps informed by queer or gender theories, and I have a significant admiration for those bodies of literatures. So I just really wanted to register this question of, well, what do we owe to one another?
Okay, thanks. Victor, you can come in right now. And
all right. I mean, I don't know if this helps tie it together or not, but it's something that Tomaz said in Michael's response, and Roger too. I was thinking about this in terms of the $60,000 a year for Duke, and you know what Duke represents, how much the brutality of extraction it takes, you know, to attend Duke. You know, so comparatively, I was thinking, you know, for that amount of money, she could have attended any number of institutions. But what's the cultural value of Duke that sort of puts all this in motion? And I think it's an interesting sort of class dynamic here in terms of, you know, for some, you know, it's a kind of relative value. For some people, going to Duke is, you know, maybe a couple of weeks of hedge fund profits. For someone else, it's 4 or 5 jobs. And I think there's this element of, even when it comes to sort of sex and sexuality, I mean, the body becomes a site of extraction. It becomes a site of extraction for capital, a site of extraction for pleasure. And I wonder if there's a way to see this as a kind of, come back to nexus, a kind of nexus of extractions around a body that need to be articulated together. I don't have an answer for that, but it seems to me that these points of extraction have to be seen, you know, synoptically, in order to sort of get a sense of exactly what, you know, what the conditions are for her situation.
I think that's a very good observation, Vic. And in fact, that's been sort of one of the implicit themes throughout all the remarks that have been going on here. And of course, Eileen, I think, very trenchantly raised the whole question of academics. And we know that academics, by their very nature, are in an extraction industry. They're extracting meaning, significance, and it's kind of the micromanaging of meaning that goes on by very often finding who they can identify as people who are marginalized or victimized and so forth, and also privilege. But in some ways, they speak from a position of privilege in order to somehow dismiss other people's privileges and so forth. And I think the kind of mean girl feminism that Michael was describing here, you know, you have mean boy academicism too. That's what the good old boy networks of yesteryear we're all about, and so forth. So, I mean, in some ways, that extraction, which is a differentiation, which is part of the kind of manipulation of our desires for a larger market-driven kind of purpose. One of the reasons that everything's marketing, I know Eileen was bemoaning that fact, is when you can market, when you can come up with a kind of magical segment, then not only can you give a prediction, but you can also say to others, well, look, if you want to be part of this, you are this, you need to consume this, and so on and so on. And academics, without realizing it, are very effective marketers, particularly when it comes to talking about sexuality as opposed to sexual practice. What I heard Michael saying is that sexuality is, in many ways, the real subversive element. Sex, not sexuality, is the really subversive element, because it undermines, it makes more fluid. In some ways, it activates intensities in the dynamic of sexual practices, which are always, in some ways flowing into different formations and structures, which is what gender really is. In some ways, gender theory is a way of managing that and also of marketing that. And I think in this paper, which I've read and which he's kind of sketched out, he does a very good way of pointing how that works. And I think in her own innocent undergraduate way, Belle Knox also does a fantastic job of pointing that out. So that's the one comment I wanted to make to say for this, and we're gonna have to wrap this up right now, and I want Michael to have the last word in either responses or any kind of new thoughts he has about all this.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I'll just say a few quick things in response. Firstly, to what Victor said about, and Carl reiterated, is about this sort of class privilege, which clearly subtends Belle Knox's desire to go to Duke rather than to go to any other school which wouldn't have placed such financial demands upon her. Now, that may not have borne in any way on her decision to go into sex work, which there are certainly two different narratives about, which are either about her love of kinky sex on the one hand, or about her indebtedness as a student on the other. Whether we can bring those two streams together is an interesting question. But I like what Victor says about the body as a site of extraction. That seems to me to be exactly what Beatriz Preciado is saying about the orgasm and about intensity, to use Carl's word, about what is extracted from the subject. So there's not just human capital, as Lazzarato says, there's also sex capital. So what is being extracted from us as entrepreneurs of the self bears just as much so to bring those things together. And I hadn't thought of that rubric, the extract, interesting term, because it also does figure into some sort of or what is taken. So seeing it less as propulsive and self-willed, as something which is extracted from us, it tells us, girl, when I talk about me and girl feminisms, I do want to be clear that apparatuses or these mechanisms of control or get caught up in them. The girl can be either male or female or gender yet, or we cannot identify yet. So the girl for me, or the mean girl, could be those old forms of against and to push against. And finally, Paul's remark about what we owe one another. I think that's really at the very bottom of everything that Belle Knox says, as Carol says in her own undergraduate, but nonetheless sharp way, which is that we are constitutively vulnerable, that we are vulnerable and exposed to others, or exposed to violence, exposed to injurability, exposed, expo, out of our skin, and that is before we are in the symbolic. So there's this constitutive vulnerability that she says we must work with rather than against. So there's all this internecine warfare and infighting in feminism, which she is saying is, in a sense, cutting off the possibility for modes of solidarity or modes of being together, which are precisely calculated on those obligations or crimes, which are, as Paul says, already made upon us. So they are there's a sort of ontologically prior vulnerability, which I think Knox is well aware of. On the other hand, I mean, the problems with libertarianism, if you read that interview with her in the Business Insider, she says things about sex work and free speech and so on, then she says, I'm actually quite conservative. So there's this sort of tension between her conservative political aspirations on the one, ones which are very or perverse positions like Tomaz to take up vis-a-vis orthodox or institutionalized academic positions on either sex or work or feminism. So politically she's an interesting figure, I think, too, because she's quite complicated. But the final thing I would say, because both Tomac and Paul mentioned that I tried to exit the quagmire of the present by looking towards more promising kinds of futures, more affirmative kinds of futures. I would say that the obligation or that which we owe to the others is a kind of IOU that I wouldn't want to insert into structures of debt as something which places us back into the quagmire, but in a sort of reversal or an anagrammatic way, IOU is also we, OUI in French, which means yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for this kind of provocative conversation we've had. And I want to thank everybody else here. And I know Michael has a very active Facebook page, and he shares things with many of us. And we can perhaps put this article up, and as well as the diagrams that he was talking from, and we'll make that available on the internet in different capacity and so forth. So I know it's late for those of you who are on the other side of the pond there, so I want to say sweet dreams, and for the rest of you that are here in the U.S., stay out of trouble for the rest of the day. And we'll do something like this related to this topic again sometime in the hopefully not too distant future. So thank you so much.